All right, good to see everybody this morning. Everybody's bright-eyed and ready to go. That's a good thing. We are still in the book of Judges right now. And if you want to turn your Bible to Judges chapter 13, today we are beginning our study of Samson. So Judges chapter 13. We'll take a look at Samson. There's a new sheet on the back table that will be for next week's study. So Samson comes in two parts, and today is part one. We're going to be covering, if we can, chapter 13, 14, and if we can get to it, chapter 15. And then the most familiar part of Samson is his marriage to and interaction with Delilah. That's in chapter 16. So we'll have that for discussion next week. Today we're in chapter 13, 14, and 15. And there's still a stack of notes for today's lesson on the back table if you want that as well. All right, so today we have three or four, I think we have three discussion questions today. We'll use those off the notes to kind of guide us through these chapters. Three questions, three chapters. And it seems like a lot. It's a lot of verses, but there's a couple of stories that will be easy enough to just sort of summarize if you've read ahead. So here's the first question. If you've read chapter 13, there's a lot about vows in this chapter. So there's the vow of not shaving the head, the vow of not eating or drinking of grapes. So the question is, explain the vows, the conditions placed on Samson's birth, and what do you think is the significance of these conditions in the context of what was happening in Israel? We'll come to this question in just a minute, which is, what are your impressions of Manoah and his wife? Those are Samson's parents. What happens in the story? What happens? Also, promises are made for the child yet to be born, so there's a pledge made for Samson in advance. What do you think are dangers of making pledges for someone else? So let's talk about the vows in this chapter. What are your thoughts on that? What do you know about these? Any suggestions, any thoughts on for Manoah's wife and for Samson himself? Any thoughts on these? The not drinking of the grape juice, the not cutting of the hair. Have you ever seen anything before like that in Scripture? Yeah. What is this? What's going on in this chapter? Art, you said you've seen it before? Okay. All right. So let's talk about what happens, because I'm convinced that the vows being encouraged here, the conditions placed upon it are saying something in contrast to what's happening with the people at this time. So take a look at verse 1. Is it surprising that in verse 1 it says, again the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord? Are we surprised by that? In every single instance of a judge, we see that prior to his judgeship, or hers, with Deborah, there's the people kind of relapsing into idolatry, paganism, fornication, all of that. And it mentions here that they ended up in the service of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, the Philistines have been constant enemies of God's people since we opened the book. Now, they've been so before, but they play a major role in conflict in the Old Testament. And already in the book of Judges, in chapter 3 and in chapter 10, we've seen them causing havoc against God's people. And even as far as chapter 10 and verse 11, and in chapter 10 verse 6, it talks about the children of Israel served the gods of the Philistines. So they had their own religion in Philistia, and they ended up not only being like them, but they also ended up in servitude to them. Doing a lot of reading this week on the 40 years, and sometimes people can't line that up. And the problem is people are trying to say that this 40 years happened prior to Samson, and then Samson comes along, and I don't think that's the case. This 40 years would extend into the reign or the tenure of Samson. So the 40 years would sort of extend into his period of being a judge. We learn a little bit about his family in verse 2. He's of the tribe of Dan. His father's of the tribe of Dan. A certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites whose name was Manoah. And if you were to go back to Joshua chapter 19, when they're settling the land and inheritance is being given out, Zoah was one of Dan's settlements, according to verses 40 and 41 of Joshua chapter 19. The word Manoah, his own name, means rest. So there's perhaps some reflection on the inheritance. I want to pick this up first before I move to the vows, which is at the end of verse 2. I'm going to ask you to sort of reflect on Bible stories in the Old Testament. It mentions Manoah, and then it says his wife was barren and had no children. Is this unique in the stories of the Old Testament? There's actually several very prominent people in the Old Testament who were barren, and just going through a few of those, can you think of some by name? Famous folks, women of the Old Testament who were barren? Sarah was for sure. So you read that early, Genesis chapter 16. She can't have children, and remember he goes to Hagar the handmaiden, and the turmoil with Ishmael and all that starts there. Can you think of others? Okay, so Hannah was certainly in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hannah couldn't have kids, and you see a very similar instance between that with Sarah. Any others? Okay, so you see a little bit when you get to the New Testament. You start getting there. How about Isaac, Jacob? Any of their wives have trouble? All right, so Rachel couldn't, and neither could Rebekah. Remember, they prayed for a long time. For years they prayed, and Rebekah couldn't either. So you've got Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, Hannah in the Old Testament, just to name a few. And in all of those cases, God intervened in a providential way in those situations. I'm convinced, because it's mentioned in the Bible, God didn't have to mention that, but the fact that they were barren and then they were then able to have kids, the barrenness mentioned is a way of setting us up to be able to see the providence of God at work in these situations. So the barrenness would highlight the work of God in His providence in each of these cases. But in all of these, this is not like the virgin conception, right? Because in all of these, they still go to their husbands, and their husbands are able, through that process to bring children into the world, but with the providential help of God. This was not a virgin miraculous birth as it was with Jesus. So looking through the text, real quick, looking through this text, if you read the chapter, what are your impressions of Manoah and Mrs. Manoah? Are they like all the other Israelites serving foreign gods at this time, or do they kind of seem to stand out a little bit? What were your thoughts on that? What do you think of them? Let's read a couple of verses, and at the end of that, tell me your impression of them. So notice in verse 3, all right, so you have the introduction to Manoah, verse 3. The angel of the Lord appeared to the woman, that's Mrs. Manoah, and says to her, "Indeed, now you're barren, you have borne no children, but you will conceive, and you will bear a son." So you have the intervention of God in their situation, which is likely unique. Drop down to verse 8. After this news comes of receiving a son, Manoah prays to the Lord and says, "Oh, my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent to us again, come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born." So not only is God intervening in their case, he prays to the Lord, right? So they have this communication channel with God. Verse 9, in response to his prayer, what does God do? He listens to them. He hearkens to them. So he's listening to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of the Lord came to the woman again, and she was sitting in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. So they're praying to God. Drop down to verse 15. So regarding this host that's come from God, Manoah says to the angel of the Lord, "Please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you." Now, he's not talking about like physically trying to tackle this person, but what are they wanting to do here? What does he say? We're going to get a young goat. What's that all about? Sacrifice. We're going to offer sacrifice. Do you think that they revered this person that they knew had come from God? that there's some respect on their part. And then in verses 19 and 20, once everything is sort of done and said, Manoah takes the young goat with the grain offering, offers it on the rock to the Lord, and he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. It happened as the flame went up toward heaven from the altar. The angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. While Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. Does it sound like they are regular in the practice of worship? So what is your opinion after reading all those verses? What's your overall consensus about Manoah and his wife? Where do they stand in relation to the rest of Israel? Yeah. Yeah. Is there a lesson there, perhaps, that even when everybody else does the wrong thing, what can you still do? You can still do the right thing. You can worship God. Even if all your people decide to do the wrong thing, you can still do what's right. And I appreciate that about Manoah. And it doesn't mean that they always did everything that was right, but it does seem like overall they were pretty faithful people. It seems like they were just good, faithful people that wanted to do the right thing and please the Lord. Now let's talk about the pledges for just a minute. Art mentioned this is not the first time we've seen this in the Old Testament. So we do see in the Old Testament, do we not, abstaining from grapes and grape juice and abstaining from the cutting of hair. Anybody want to comment on that? Joel, you just walked in. What is this exactly? It's a Nazirite vow. There's actually a section that addresses this in the Old Testament. In the book of Numbers, chapter 6, there's an outline of these types of pledges made within the Nazirite vow. And here's the interesting thing. There were some Nazirite vows that were taken and they extended for the entire life of the person. And somebody mentioned just a moment ago Samuel. Samuel was one of those folks, right? Because for his entire life he never drank grape juice and ate of grapes. He just didn't do that for his whole life. But most Nazirite vows were for a limited period of time. Most of them were. And we see in the Old Testament, the majority of people who took a Nazirite vow did so for a limited period of time, days, weeks, a little longer than that, and then it was done. But this is what most people miss when reading this story. Most people think the only person this applied to was Samson, but there's another person that was required to sort of abstain from this. Who was the other person? His mom. His mother was. And if you actually start, notice in verse 3, he appears to the woman, says, "Indeed, now you're barren, you have no children, but you'll conceive and bear a son. Now, therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink and not to eat anything unclean." So a vow condition was placed upon her. Equally, it was placed upon Samson. So she wasn't to drink strong drink, and the Philistines were known for strong drink. They were just drunkards, and so it's set in contrast to that. She's not to eat anything unclean. As far as Samson is concerned, drop down to verse 5, on him is placed the condition, no razor shall come upon his head, the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. And then if you drop down to verse 7, he also is placed upon him the condition of drinking no grape juice, no wine, nothing that came from grapes, no wine, no similar drink, nothing unclean. He shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Now that part would extend for his life. So a Nazirite vow would be applied to him in that sense. Why is that so significant? Doesn't it seem like an odd time to place a vow on somebody? Because they seem really far removed from that. It doesn't seem to me that these would be in vogue right now in the judges. Why would God require that? What would be the reason for that? And there's no wrong answer here. What do you think are the purposes of God requesting that of Mrs. Manoah and of Samson? What would he be doing? Especially for her. Why would it be important for her? Yeah, Art?
I think we even see today that we know from medical science now.
Oh, yeah, medically.
Women who are pregnant.
Absolutely.
Certain things that cause the complications that cause them baby. But that the one of the things that strikes me is that God is one that sets somebody apart.
And that's it. What Art just said is part of the key. The word Nazirite itself means set apart, right? So these are vows that kind of set people apart. This to me is a lot like Abraham. Remember, God tells Abraham, "I'm going to bless you. your seed is going to be without number. You're going to have descendants. It's going to be amazing. And as a part of that, he said, now I want you to take your son and do what with your son? Take him and sacrifice him. Why would he do that? What was he doing for Abraham? He's testing his faith, right? And I think he's doing the same thing with Mrs. Manoah here. You're barren. I'm going to give you a child. And here's the condition placed upon the child, but I want you to do some things too. And by doing that, like Art said, there's a physical benefit for that, a physiological benefit, but I think there's also a spiritual benefit in what he was doing, which was testing her. And by doing this, he's setting them apart. So in both of them, Mrs. Manoah and in Samson, there is a visible act of sanctification in contrast to what everybody in Israel was doing at this time, and nobody seemingly was sanctified for this people because they were doing evil in verse 1. Now, let's talk real quick about this, and I know it happened more a long time ago than it does today. You see it with Hannah. She pledges Samuel in service to the Lord. You see it here with Manoah. This is the pledge that's going to be taken for the son. What do you think about making a pledge for someone else? What are your thoughts on that? This is just a practical discussion, right? I'm not suggesting what happened here was wrong. God is the one who required it. But what do you think about making pledges? Say for your kids. What do you think about that? Good, bad? Bad idea. Why is it so bad? Okay, that's your ABA. Why would it be terrible, though, for me to make a pledge for someone else, or for you to say, you know what, I'm making a pledge for my brother or my sister or my son or my daughter? Why would we not want to do that? Yeah. Freedom of choice? Yeah, okay, giving them freedom of choice, Gloria. Same thing. Do you think a pledge made by someone else for you means as much to you as it did to them? And there's a likelihood that it won't stick, right? Because like they were just saying, we're all free decision makers. We have the right of choice. And it may mean something to you to take a pledge, right, this, to the Lord or to something else. But once you are able and capable of making that decision for yourself, it may not stick because you may not be as in tune with that decision as somebody else was. And there's a potential rejection of that because it just doesn't mean as much as it did. So I think there's at least a lesson to be learned in that. So real quick, what happens in the rest of the story, the vows are there. There's a little bit of back and forth about the explaining of the vows. We just read the part about the young goat, the sacrifice, and the demonstration by God. But by the end of the chapter, Samson is born. In verse 24, the woman bore a son, called his name Samson. The child grew, and the Lord blessed him. The Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him of Mahina Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. And we'll see some of those places come back into play later in chapter 15, because it just gets more exciting as the book goes along. Yeah, Dana, real quick. I think so. And I think you see that even in the next chapter, when he's about to pick somebody for a wife, they're obviously very concerned about the impact of that on him. Yeah. 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 How difficult that is to train your child never to do that, but to explain the reasons for that too. I think it goes to, because the story skips, he's born, he's a young boy, and then he's an adult man, and somewhere between that, he was taught to respect those conditions. So it took a lot on Manoah and Mrs. Manoah to do. Yeah. They strike me as just faithful, good people, intent on doing the Lord's will. They strike me as that. Yeah. All right, so let's get to number 2, because we're trying to cover chapter 14 and chapter 15 today. All right, so number 2, are the concerns of Samson's parents about his choice in women, are they justified? In chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. If so, what are the dangers parents should consider when children are looking for a spouse? How are their concerns justified in the rest of the story? How does the rest of the story work out? And you talk about plot twists. These are interesting if you've read these chapters. What parallels, if any, do you see in this story to another part of his life? And what lessons or lesson is there to be learned in here? Should he have learned something from this experience. So let's talk about what's happening here. Are their concerns justified? Did you read ahead? What's the problem here in first 4 verses? He's trying to pick somebody to marry outside of the Israelites. So look at verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah. He saw a woman in Timnah, the daughter of the Philistines. Now that tells us immediately she's not part of God's people. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I've seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, go get her for me as a wife. And if you've already read through all the stories, this is his kryptonite. Women are his kryptonite. He just loves women, and he likes beautiful women. And he sees this woman. He wants to marry this woman. He says, you go down and you get her for me. So his father and mother said, well, is there not among the daughters of your brethren a woman, or among all the people, that you have to go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, you got to get her for me, for she pleases me well. She's beautiful, pleases me well. All right, so let's talk about what's happening here. They're obviously concerned, right, because she is of the daughters of the Philistines. And we saw last week in part of our discussion in Deuteronomy chapter 7, it was forbidden. God said, don't do it. Don't take a daughter from somebody outside of your people. And they had probably, Manoah and his wife had probably seen in their own life the results of that in just Israel around them. They had seen people intermarrying, and they've seen that practically. And the Philistines especially were despised enemies of God. So it just seems strange that he would want to do that. So he requests in verse 2 that they go get this woman for a wife for him. And that seems like a strange request. I mean, it would seem strange today for somebody to say, this woman's beautiful, now you go set it up and I'll marry her. Why would he say that to them? What's going on here? Is he incapable of wooing a woman by himself? Oh, okay, so that's what it's all about. Like Angie said, there was a custom back then that it was actually the parents of the man to arrange for the marriage, and a dowry would be paid and all of that. Art? Well, good.
I was impressed with the whole thing, but I thought that's awful strange. He had never seen her, never met her, didn't know anything about her.
Yeah, and for ages, that's the way it worked, and it doesn't work that way today in many places, but it did a long time ago. But you wonder, that idea probably wouldn't be very popular these days because people want to see what they're getting into first, and that's interesting for sure. But I know that's exactly what was happening here. It was an arranged marriage, and they were negotiating the details of the marriage and agreeing on the terms of the dowry that would be paid to the family of the bride. Exactly. Right. You'd appreciate the wisdom of your parents and being able to maybe see some things that you can't see. That's a good thing. That's a good point. And here's the interesting thing. In verse 4 it says, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord. Does that mean that God is now approving of this marriage? That all of a sudden he's fine with people marrying outside of Israel? No. But in reading this, when it says it was of the Lord, he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. What's the point there? What's he doing? Okay, God actually can take the disobedience of somebody and use that to his benefit. And that's what's going on here. He's going to take Samson's insistence that he marry inside the Philistines, and he's going to use that as an occasion to strike down and harm the Philistines. And so he's going to do that. And we've seen people do that in the Old Testament where they were rejecting God, but God took their rejection and used it for his benefit, like in Pharaoh, right? So Pharaoh rejected God, but God used his rejection for his greater glory. Going back to what Art said real quick, this is part of the practical part of this was that, do parents have a place in that? And I understand that marriages are different today, right? The courtships are different. The way the entire process is different. And parents might not be able to technically stop somebody from getting married today, but can they still use their influence to help their children be alerted to potential dangers? And I think Art was making a really good point. When you're young and you don't really have a lot of experience in life, you may not see outside of she's beautiful or he's really handsome and we just get along so well together, but maybe the parents see something where they're like, hey, something's not right about this relationship. And what are some things that a parent might look for in a potential mate for their kids and say, this might not be good for you? What could they see potentially in a person? Okay, that'd be the huge thing, is a faith difference, because like we talked of last week, that kind of is the catalyst for all kinds of differences in a marriage. So do they have bad habits or bad traits against the Lord? Are their priorities out of whack? Is there a lack of interest in truth and just reality in general? How does that all work out? So they may not be able to stop it, but they might be able to influence their child to see something in another, and that probably should have been the case here. And they were doing it early. They were saying, is there somebody besides the enemies of God's people that you could marry into? So the rest of the story in chapter 14, and this is such a great story. I'm going to just summarize real quick so we can get to the last question. Well, what happens here? You tell me. They're on the way down. What happens on the way to go arrange this marriage? Okay, so there's a lion that comes out. And the description of this is just great. Verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. So he's obviously endowed with God endows him with power. And he just tears the lion apart, verse 6, as one would tear apart a young goat. He's just whipping it from pole to pole. He obviously just excels over this lion, though he had nothing in his hand. He just does it with his bare hands. He kills the lion, and he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. So they're on the way, and they don't see it, but he kills the lion. They go down, and after they're coming back, he sees the same lion, but it's the carcass of the lion, and what's growing inside the lion now? There's a bee's nest, there's honeycomb, and honey, and he takes, and he's eating of it, and he gives to his parents. They still don't know where it comes from, and they're just enjoying it. So then they come back again. There's several trips being made, and they're going back now for the wedding, right? It's been arranged. I'm sure dowry's been agreed upon. They go back down in verse 10. They go down to the woman. Samson has a feast. This is the marriage feast, and likely because he didn't bring anybody, they bring a bunch of the friends of the bride out, 30 of them to be exact, to kind of be the friends of the bridegroom on this occasion. And Samson, being the kind of guy he is, sees this as an occasion to challenge them. He's going to challenge them with a wager of clothing. These were expensive garments, right? So he challenges them. In verse 30, he goes, I'm going to pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast. So they had up until the ending of the feast. Then I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. That's a lot of money. They must have had some wealth, Manoah and Mrs. Manoah. And then verse 13, he said, but if you can't explain it to me, then what I would have given to you, you actually owe me. Right? So give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. And they said, okay, pose your riddle. And in verse 14, he says, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. What's he talking about? The lion and the honeycomb and the honey inside the lion. Now, nobody would know that. Not even his parents knew it, because he didn't even tell his parents. So in verse 14 at the end, they wrestled with this for 3 days, and they are stumped. Like, what in the world could that possibly mean? And so they're wrestling with this. Apparently, this entire time, his wife is also struggling with this, because it came to pass on the 7th day that they come to Samson's wife, and they say, would you please entice your husband that he can explain this riddle for us? And if you don't, we're going to burn your house down. That's what they say. Explain this, or we'll burn you and your father's house with fire. We're going to burn you to the ground. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? He's going to take advantages of us if we don't do that. And then she goes, verse 16, she weeps on him. And she says, you only hate me. You do not love me. You've posed a riddle to the sons of my people, these friends of mine, but you've not explained it to me. And he said, look, I have not explained it to my father or mother. I haven't even told them, so why would I explain it to you? And she weeps on him for the 7 days. She must have been trying, but it's there coming to her and saying, look, if you don't do this, we're going to burn your house down. And it happened on the 7th day, the last day, that he tells her, because she pressed much on him. And then she turns and she explains the riddle to the sons of the people, and they come right back and they say, we've got it. We know exactly what this is. They say, what's sweeter than honey and what's stronger than lion? And he says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. What's he saying? I know exactly what you did. I know exactly what you did. There's no way you could have known this except that you pressed my wife for the answer. And so verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and what's he do to those 30 men? He kills them. He kills those 30 men. He goes down from Ashkelon. He kills the 30 of their men, takes their apparel, and gives the changes of clothing to those who explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. So the folks that solved it, the 30 men, he actually goes and kills 30 Philistines and takes their clothing and gives it to them, and they know exactly what happens. And Samson's wife, at the end, verse 20, was given to his companion, it says, who had been his best man. Now, we're not really sure who that guy is, but the Philistines so disrespected that arrangement that they took and were going to then betroth her to another man instead of to Samson because they hated him so much. Reading that story, does it sound really similar to something else? And if so, what does it sound like? Like he knows a secret and the wife keeps coming and just saying, please, you don't even love me if you won't tell me this. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like Delilah. And it's just like the same story with different women repeats itself. And you think, did you not learn your lesson, son, when it comes to this? Because it sure sounds like that. Any thoughts on this story? Because it's about to take a turn even for the worse. Any thoughts on this? All right, so let's get to chapter 15 real quick, because the story continues in chapter 15. All right, question number 3. Explain the plot involving the Philistines and Samson's wife and father-in-law. What event served as the catalyst for what happens? And then what does this teach us about the choices we make in life and consequences of choices? What happens in this story? So he kills those 30 men, and then what happens? They take his wife and they say, we're going to give her to another man, and then what happens? All right, watch carefully, verse 1. In the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. Now, the Bible still calls her his wife. God still honors that marriage. And he said, let me go in to my wife into her room, but her father would not permit him to go. So he actually takes a gift down to her. This is like a conjugal visit, right? He's wanting to be with his wife, and the father is not going to allow that. The father's sort of given into the whims of the Philistines. And her father says in verse 2, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. I just thought you hated her. So here's what I'll do. I've got a younger daughter, her sister, and I'll give you the younger sister. Why would he do that? And I can't be for sure in this situation, but I have a guess. Yeah, there's some placation going on here. And plus, didn't Manoah and Mrs. Manoah already make the arrangements of the former marriage, and they would have likely paid a pretty expensive dowry? If you get her to marry the next daughter, what do you get? Another dowry. You kind of double dip on that, and it seems to me like maybe that's what's going on here. And Samson says, this time I'll be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. What's he saying there? If you're not going to give me my wife, what am I going to do? I'm going to take my revenge, and I'll be fully right in doing that. So Samson goes, in verse 4, he catches 300 foxes. And the word caught here literally means to catch in a trap. I'm sure he could have done it barehanded, but he's probably using some snares, and he's catching them. The word foxes there could also mean jackals. Either one would work. And he catches them, and what does he do to the foxes? He 2 by 2, so he takes 2 and he ties their tails together, and he puts a flame right in the middle and sends them out into these dry crop fields, and what happens? Sets the fields on fire, just destroys their crops. And so in verse 5, he sets the torches on fire, lets the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain as well as the vineyard and the olive groves. He destroys their produce. So in verse 6, the Philistines say, who did this? And they say, well, Samson. And so because he had taken his wife and given her to his companions, so the Philistines came up. And in verse 6, what do they do at the end of it? They kill his wife and his father-in-law. They kill her and her father. They burn him to death. That's the threat they made back in the previous chapter. So Samson says, well, because you did this, I'm going to take my revenge. Well, he's already done that before. He's already had revenge twice already. He's doing it a third time. It just never ends, this revenge process. And he says, I'll take revenge on you after I will see. So he attacks them hip and thigh, which just means he was like swift and mighty. It's just a proverbial expression that he did that with great slaughter. And then he goes down to the cleft, the rock of Edom, which is just southwest of, it's probably around Bethlehem of Judah, probably where this was. And it's just a resting place. And he goes and he rests. He thinks it's over with. Well, the Philistines declare war. And so in verse 9, they go up and encamped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lai. And so they just declare war against the children of Israel. And the men of Judah come, about 3,000 of them. They actually come out to arrest Samson. And they say, why have you come up? Or he said, why have you come up? The men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? So they answered, well, we've come up to arrest Samson to do to him as he's done to us. 3,000 men of Judah went down to the rock, and they said, do you know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you've done? He said, as they did to me, so I've done to them. And they said, well, we've come down to arrest you. Verse 12, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines. Then Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. Now, why would they come to arrest Samson? He's on their side. Who are they serving? The Philistines. Philistines said, we'll flex our muscle, we'll take it out on you. And they said, well, okay, we'll go arrest him and bring him to you. And Samson says, you don't kill me, you just take me to them. And when he gets to them, the real slaughter happens, because the Bible says they tied him with rope. It obviously wasn't going to hold. And when he gets down there, verse 15, he finds a fresh jawbone. Now, why would it say fresh? The Bible says that on purpose. What happens to a skull or a bone that's been sitting for a while? It gets real brittle, doesn't it? This is fresh. It's literally moist, meaning it still retains all of its strength. And he takes a jawbone of a donkey, and he takes it, and he kills 1,000 men with it. Amazing, right? And so he even says, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. And so it was when he's finished, you can just see him speaking. He just takes and he just throws the jawbone down to the ground. He's done, right? He's killed 1,000 of those people. And after that, he's very thirsty, obviously a great battle. He says to the Lord, you've given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. Now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? He's concerned now if he should actually, dehydrate and his body were laying on the ground. He's concerned about the Philistines defiling his body, and God provides the water. And the story ends in verse 20 with him judging Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And people say the Bible is boring. That's a pretty exciting story, if you ask me. That's amazing to even contemplate, to visualize that, him standing on the edge of a cliff, just slaying 1,000 people, some probably even just jumping off to get out of the way, but an amazing thing here. What do you learn in all of this, in chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15? What do you get out of all this? Do choices have consequences? Where did all of this start? Where did it start for Samson? You picked a bad woman to marry. And look at all of this. That's what happened to him. I mean, he chose this, and it immediately tied him to the wickedness of the Philistines and their retribution and their vengeance, and it became this game between the both of them, and it ended up with this. And he's not done with them, because he's going to pick Delilah, and she falls right back in with that group, and so it just seems to go back over again. So go ahead and if you didn't get the notes for chapter 16, and we're gonna take a look at Delilah, because the story is very similar. It's the most familiar story, I think, in the book of Judges. And I have a question about the end of chapter 16. What you think happens? Because I don't know. I'm interested to hear your perspective on that. Does he repent at the end, or is it something else? And I'll be interested to hear your perspective on that. Thank you so much. We'll put a peg in it here. Come back chapter 16 next week, and then we have 2 remaining weeks where we're asking the question, what kind of sins destroy nations? Because that's what the end of the book is about. They destroy themselves. But how did they do that? Thank you, guys.